You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Christopher Media, let's make some noise.
En 1887, un terrible séisme a englouti l'archipel de Goto. À présent, une seule île est tout ce qui reste de ce royaume. Toutes relations ont cessé avec le reste du monde. L'île de Goto a été condamnée à l'oubli. Le gouverneur Goto III, comme les précédents gouverneurs de l'île de Goto, veille à ce que soient conservées les mœurs et traditions telles qu'elles existaient avant la mémorable catastrophe. Pierre Brasseur, le gouverneur Goto III. Ligia Branis, Glossia, épouse du gouverneur dans Goto, l'île d'amour. Avec Jean-Pierre Andréani, Ginette Leclerc, Guy Saint-Jean. Dari, Goto, l'île d'amour. Un grand film de Walerian Borowczyk. René Thévenet et Louis Duchesne présentent Pierre Brasseur. Ligia Branis dans Goto, l'île d'amour. Le film des façons humaines. Goto, l'île d'amour.
Welcome to the projection booth. I'm your host, Mike White. Joining me once again is Miss Kat Ellinger.
Hello.
Also back in the booth after far too long is Mr. Daniel Bird.
It's a pleasure to be back, Mike.
Polish Month continues, kind of, with a look at Walerian Borowczyk's Goto Island of Love. Released in that magical year of 1969, the film tells the tale of a thief on the island of Goto, which is ruled over by Governor Goto III. After being pitted in armed combat and somehow surviving, he is put in charge of the governor's dogs, boots, and the killing of flies. Of course, we will be spoiling this film, so if you haven't seen Goto, you have been warned. So, Daniel, I have to ask, when was the first time you saw this film, and what did you think?
I saw it in London at the ICA, so the Institute of Contemporary Arts, in the spring of 1997. I'd seen some of Borowczyk's shorts at my local film theatre in Stoke-on-Trent. This was in 94, and I'd managed to see Blanche, the film he made after Goto, on video cassette, which was released by BFI. So I had a huge expectation about what Goto should be, and it lived up to them. I thought it was, I loved the atmosphere of the film, the fact that it was like a whole total world, and I think that's what interested me about that particular film. It was like Eraserhead by David Lynch, the idea that you are going into a world, and that's what Goto kind of offered. I also remember that screening because I was worried about missing the last bus from London to Stoke-on-Trent, and I watched the whole film worried about, am I going to catch the bus? Am I going to catch the bus? And the film finished, and I ran. I did catch the bus, but I was so tired, I fell asleep on the bus. And I went past Stoke to Chester. So, yeah, my memories of Goto are actually mixed up with being stuck in Chester at 3 o'clock in the morning trying to work out how to get back to Stoke before 9 o'clock.
The perils of living outside London.
Exactly. So, that was my commitment, going all the way to London on a National Express bus to see a shitty 60mm print of Goto in the small ICA cinema, which, if you don't know the small ICA cinema, I mean, an iPhone has a bigger screen.
Of course, you're saying it correctly by saying Goto, but me, having learned basic in 7th grade, I keep thinking Goto, 10, Goto 20, 20, print, hello.
I'm sure Borowczyk would have approved.
Kat, what was your first experience with this one?
My first one is because of the camera Obscura box set that Daniel produced, obviously. It's going to sound bad now, but I only knew the ruder Borowczyk films before that box set. So it was a bit of an eye-opener to see the more, I don't want to say the more serious stuff, but the less sexual stuff. And I really fell in love with it, and Blanche as well. I think because of, like what Daniel said, it's this complete world, but it's also quite whimsical, and it's like a bit of a dark fairy tale. Same with Blanche as well. And it's got those same sort of doom romance themes in it as his later stuff. So I really fell in love with it. I didn't realise how dark it was, though, until watching it for this episode during this pandemic. The whole totalitarian government and post-disaster society. Just so many things sort of chime this time that I hadn't really picked up on. But I just think it's a wonderful film. It's like a really tactile experience, because of all the little models and the little things. And yeah, it just really surprised me when I first saw it. And all of those shorts and everything, because that was the first time I'd seen any of those. Like, I'd seen Immoral Tales and The Beast and the saucier ones, obviously, but I'd never got round to seeing it. Wow, it's just because they're really hard to see anyway. So I'd never really got round to seeing the earlier stuff.
This was actually a first-time watch for me for this podcast. I had gotten the Blu-ray/DVD in the mail a few years ago, courtesy of Daniel, because I donated to, was it a Kickstarter or Indiegogo?
Kickstarter.
And I don't know if people know this, but if you donate to a Kickstarter that Daniel runs, he will come on your podcast. So it's just taken a few years for that. But that was one of the perks. So I was just like, okay, yeah, and come on the podcast. And I agree. I love the world that this creates. We've talked about Borowczyk before on the show. We talked about Lamarge a few years ago. And the use of objects, that is one thing that always comes up when it comes to Borowczyk, and just the idea of this world, this island community of Goto, that they have been cut off from the rest of the world since, 1887. And so things are being used not necessarily in the way that they're supposed to be used. The one scene that is so telling for me is when we are first exposed to the music of the island, and we have this guy who's got a singing saw, and then we've got another guy who has this weird contraption that is kind of a stringed instrument, and then we have these cellos right behind them, and it's like, what are you doing? Why aren't you using these cellos? And the cellos are just like backdrop to these guys who are just using these weird makeshift things, and that's so much of this movie, is just these objects being used in different ways, or different types of objects. The whole thing with the 2 feet that spin around that hold the boots. There are so many interesting objects. The flycatcher itself, it's so great to look at. And I love the look of this film, especially the use, or I should say the lack of shadows, that everything is so flat that this looks like almost an animated film, the way that it's shot.
That, of course, reflects Borowczyk's background, because, of course, he trained as a painter and a sculptor, and then he worked as a printer. That's really how he kind of made a name for himself. He got the national prize in Poland in 1953, the year of Stalin's death, for a cycle of socialist realist prints of Nowa Huta, which is an industrial town built in the suburbs of Krakow. And then after that, he did film posters for not very long, about a couple of years. And then he sort of made this transition into film. Now, the fact is that ever since he was a child, he was a keen amateur filmmaker on 8 and 16 millimeter. But he used this opportunity together with another poster artist, Jan Lenica, to really kind of import the language of the Polish poster, which is quite remarkable because it kind of treats films but uses techniques we associate with modern art, like collage or kind of expressionistic kind of styles and things like that. So suddenly these kind of Polish posters were moving with these incredible soundtracks. And I think it's interesting, so that when Borowczyk started to make more and more live action films, first in short films in the 1960s, and finally with a feature like Goto, he kind of approaches the frame in a particularly graphic way. The way in which he composes shots, of course, relates very much to how he kind of composed action for his animated films. And I think that, you know, that's where that comes from. I mean, it's very disorientating because it doesn't really, everything is in kind of landscape and profile, and he's constantly cutting in these 90-degree angles. And it's a very simple but effective means of kind of cutting from shot to shot, scene to scene, just through this kind of like these knights moves constantly.
I grew up like a huge fan of Terry Gilliam, especially Brazil and the Time Bandits. And it's weird then going back to Borowczyk and then just seeing how much he influenced Gilliam. So even though it's like really surreal and strange, some of it, I had some sort of frame of reference for it growing up loving Gilliam's films. And it definitely has that strange sort of fairy tale aspect to it. Like when we talked about Case of the Rookie Hangman, and you just get these strange fantasy societies with these weird little inventions, and you just look at them and you just think, how the hell does someone come up with that? Just out of the air. It's really sublime. To go back to what Daniel was saying about the Polish posters, those posters are incredible. Like the Polish always have like an amazing, like even for some crappy sort of Hollywood film, you see the Polish poster and you're like, fucking hell. Like, I tell you, all that effort in some crap film. They are incredible. It's an interesting point, though. They're like art installations, especially these earlier films. They're like moving art installations.
But in a very unpretentious way, because if you say art film or art, there is a certain baggage which comes with it, which
I totally
which is
agree.
not there at all in those films.
No,
in the way
this is
that
a craftsperson. Yeah. This is somebody who works with their hands. You know, I don't mean art as in this very pretentious art way, just in a very pure. I think that's what I love about his films is they and we talked about this when we did Zhuowski the other week. It's the lack of pretension, I think, that I love the most. It's not like I'm going to make this thing and be kind of show-offy about it and make a statement. It's just you just feel there's an absolute love there because of the detail that's gone into every little prop. Like that fly box is incredible with the little hairs.
He made a number of short films, which it's useful either to watch the short films first before watching Goto or watching them afterwards, because I interviewed for the Camera Obscura box, which Kat mentioned, a photographer who was very influenced by Borowczyk when he was a student at St. Martin's in London, called Craigie Horsfield. And he put forward the idea, he said that a handful of short films and Goto and the Theatre of Mr. and Mrs. Cabal, which is a partially animated feature Borowczyk made before Goto. He said it constituted a coherent text. By that he meant it was almost like a suite, and that they all kind of culminate in Goto. And I think that's very true, because you can see little etudes, little studies, a lot of these short films, and they all sort of like fit together and blossom into Goto. All of them, I would say, like Goto was on Borowczyk's mind for a good 10 years. Kind of the earliest synopsis I've seen is written in Polish in 1958 when he was still in Poland. And that year he made a short called The School, Szkoła, which it's like all the visual iconography of Goto is there in that short film. It's about a soldier which is going through some sort of military drill or training in an infinite variations, constantly in a circular loop. And so it's like time doesn't exist. He's just kind of doing these kind of endless, pointless, absurd kind of exercises. And so you have that kind of out of time, that repetition and no real action and no real consequence. That kind of absurdist ambience is there in the school. Visually, it takes place against that kind of a brick wall, and that kind of drab, crumbling brickwork is very prominent in the kind of the look and art direction of Goto. And also this contrast between this kind of military, almost dictator-like mode of existence with kind of inner fantasy or kind of sexual desire, because in the case of the school, the soldier falls asleep and has a dream of the dancing girl's legs. And there's a fly in that short as well, which kind of, when he's trying to aim his gun, the fly lands on the barrel. So it's like everything was there and it was on his head. And then he made a film with Jan Lenica, another poster artist, called Dom, or The House, which is a meditation on kind of movement itself. So the idea of, early, it uses a lot of that kind of chronophotography, that kind of like early studies in movement, which we associate with Muybridge, but in this case it's Etienne Jules Marais. Then what he did, and he's quite explicit about this in some of his notes, he wanted to expand on the ideas and techniques in the episodes in Dom. And one of them is Renaissance, which is a still life, a table with some objects, and the film begins with an explosion, and then the objects reconstruct themselves. The film is in black and white, except for one shot of color at the end with the explosion. And of course, because it ends with an explosion and starts with an explosion, it sort of loans itself to a kind of a constant loop. Well, you could easily imagine that you could project Renaissance in a kind of a loop in a gallery space. And he did another film called Diptych in 67, which was a short documentary with a kind of in black and white with direct sound. And it has this kind of counterpart film, which is in color with recorded sound with music. And it's almost like the two films are kind of completely opposite, but because they're made in counterpoint to one another, they form a whole. And it's like applying a diptych in art, in painting, like a painting in two halves with the relationship, applying that to cinema. So you can easily imagine that. I mean, perhaps these days you would see that in a gallery with like two screens, opposing each other. But I think in the way in which he conceives these films, there's no sort of like price of admission, let's say, whereby you have to bring a master's degree in art history before you can appreciate it. You can appreciate a lot of these short films. It's like I did. They're like funny animations on TV late at night, yeah. Or you can pontificate at great length about the symbols and everything else of this, which is perfectly fine too. But at the end of the day, I think what's remarkable about Borowczyk's early films and these short films is that they work on both levels. You could write a whole book on one of the shorts, or you could show them to a 6-year-old kid and they'll still be entertained.
That was the great thing about having the box set with everything in order. When I got it, that's what I did. I just started at the beginning, worked my way through. And it really helps you understand how he progresses. And like you said, how he repeats things later on, these experiments. It's like you can see how he's developing and testing. And so I think that box set is just one of the most amazing things I think I've ever written about. I got it to review. I didn't get the actual box set because I couldn't afford it at the time, and then it sold out. And I was really gutted about that. You often don't get that in home video box sets, just this whole idea that it presents a vision. It's incredible work, Daniel, because it's just so valuable, I think. You can just sit there and go from the beginning to the end.
Well, I mean, a lot of it, I mean, you have to credit Michael Brook, who was, I was the co-producer on this. There was James White, who was the head of restoration at Arrow. He was actually, and then Francesco Simeone, who okayed the project, because originally, actually, how the box set started is not unlike how Goto progresses in Goto Island of Love, because originally Arrow asked me to interview Terry Gilliam for Time Bandits, which I did. And then at the end of the interview, I asked him about Borowczyk, because I knew he'd mentioned Borowczyk in an interview. And then I took that footage to Arrow. And basically, and then, because Michael Brook and James White, when they were at the BFI, they'd already planned and they wanted to release a set of short films by Borowczyk, because they'd worked together on these Jan Schwankmeyer set, which was fantastic, and then the Brothers Quay. But it's always been complicated with the rights to those early films, and on top of that, Borowczyk's reputation based on his later films, particularly at that time. And I think the BFI changed focus, and both Michael and James went to Arrow, so all the bits came together. And then Arrow said, well, actually, we want to relaunch our Arrow Academy line to kind of keep up with, the great work of Criterion and Masters of Cinema. So I think they were looking for a project which was a bit left of field, something which, instead of saying this is a classic art film, it's let's treat this as a classic art film. And I think it was a bold move to take these titles and put it in the Arrow Academy range rather than the Arrow Video range, because you can imagine the Beast and the Moral Tales in the Arrow Video range.
But to actually
then to say that it's in the Academy is like a statement. So it all worked out.
And Gilliam supported the Kickstarter, didn't he?
The interview for the Kickstarter campaign was actually the end of the interview I did for Time Bandits, and I actually asked him, said, look, would it be possible to use this as part of the campaign? Because there was a big court case where Borowczyk was reclaiming the rights to his films, in particular Blanche. And so by the end of his life, he'd actually got the rights to the short films, about 9 short films, and then 2 features, The Theatre of Mr. and Mrs. Cabell and Blanche. But he didn't have any materials, and by that I mean, copies from which you could release on video. And the copies kind of in the UK were all falling apart. So it just coincided that Arrow were making a name for themselves by making new masters of film, particularly films which, let's say, were not necessarily famous cult films. And so there was the agreement was between Legia Borowczyk and Arrow to restore Blanche, Mr. and Mrs. Cabell, and the 9 shorts. And then they had the idea, well, let's do the other 3 features which belong to Argos Films, which is Goto, Island of Love, and Moral Tales and the Beast. And so that's how that box set arrived. And it was a big risk for Arrow because, Borowczyk had an proven reputation. I mean, would people buy these releases? I mean, obviously they would buy The Beast and the Moral Tales, but would they buy the earlier films? I was very keen, and it was almost a condition that the emphasis should be on the earlier films, particularly Goto, also Blanche, and the shorts. Because those were the films to reclaim and rediscover. And Arrow went along with that. And then when we did the retrospective, we focused on Goto.
That was why because I was saving up to get it, and I couldn't believe how quickly it sold out. I was literally 2 weeks off having and I was just like, whoa. Because, I mean, the campaign was really good. And obviously a lot of people were blind buying it. But when it was announced, I was just like, I can't believe they're doing this. And then I thought, I'll have a few weeks to, get the money together. And it just went, which is a great thing, I guess, because then it gave Arrow the confidence to take more risks with other things. Yeah.
I mean, I agree. I think that it's, I'm extremely grateful, for Terry Gilliam to allow us to actually use that fragment as part of the campaign, because it kind of established a narrative of Terry Gilliam's endorsement of Borowczyk, which was really important because it helps with the media aspect of the campaign, and that's something which can't be ignored. I mean, the more people that know about it, the more they can contribute. I think it did. I don't know how Terry Gilliam feels about this, but it did kind of establish a story whereby everything which Terry Gilliam got for the Monty Python animations came from Borowczyk, which is not really true. In the way that I think that a lot of people, a lot of filmmakers, suddenly realized the possibilities of making films using cutouts in a particular fashion. Borowczyk was there early, so was Jan Lanica, and then there were people like Larry Jordan in the US and Gilliam. So it was, but at the same time, it really helped the campaign to actually have Gilliam's name, to have people framing the film in the context of Terry Gilliam's films and Monty Python. And I think that those were really good associations to have. And, it was very lucky and had a lot of, attention, which it came as a big surprise to me, at least.
And I agree. I don't think he was completely influenced by Borowczyk, but you can see, there's some influence there, but it does give you, coming into it blind, it gives you that frame of reference. If you've grown up on Monty Python, if you've grown up on things like the Time Bandits, you can then watch a film like Goto and you don't feel completely flailing around in the dark. You can get into it on that level. Like you said, this sort of crazy animation, this strange sort of fantasy vibe. You don't have to be approaching it from up high, like some filmmakers. Like you said, you have to understand all this stuff about art, and it can just feel too intimidating. And I think that Gilliam reference was, the thing, because so many people, especially in the UK, especially people like my age who grew up on things like the Time Bandits, was suddenly interested in a film like Goto. Can you imagine if they didn't have that reference, how much it would, some strange French-Polish film that, that's on an art label. I don't think it would have had the same resonance.
Not at all. The one thing I do regret is that before, it was about 6 months, maybe even earlier, maybe a year before the Camera Obscura box set came out, there was a theatrical re-release of Time Bandits. And there's a short film by Borowczyk called Gavotte, which of course has a bearing on Goto, because the idea of the short film is that, as the title implies, it's based on a piece of music, and the kind of the emotion of the music and the length of the music serve as kind of parameters for this little drama. It is conceptual, and it sounds terribly dry, but it's not dry at all, because the film is really about a recital of a piece of music in high society, but Borowczyk, Tom and Jerry style, uses the camera frame to focus on two dwarves, and he kind of frames it as such whereby you can't see the people who are kind of like, they're all at waist height, like in a Tom and Jerry cartoon, and they're having a fight during this music, and it's hilarious. But at the same time, it would have been perfect as a short to go with Time Bandits. And I think that's what's interesting about the two filmmakers, because I think visually Gilliam is very, very different from Borowczyk, because Gilliam is very, very baroque and like Orson Welles with his wide angle lenses, and everything's in the frame, absolutely everything in terms of the costumes. There's more is more, everything's in the frame and the camera movement. Whereas Borowczyk, in fact, is the opposite, the absolute opposite. He talked about this in an interview around the time of The Beast. And he said that he looks through the viewfinder and he eliminates. And I think if you look at the film, I mean, we always talk about him using kind of long lenses to give a very flattened out image. But another consequence of using those kind of long focal lengths is that if you're filming, for example, a table, the wider the lens, you get the whole table, bits of the room and the windows. Whereas if you're using a long lens, you just end up with a few things in the frame. And then if you look through the frame, and then decide what is the absolute minimum I need to make this function as a shot. And if there's anything which is kind of superfluous, he'll get rid of it. So he's kind of like composing shots, almost like isotypes, like when you go to a toilet and they kind of reduce man and woman to this almost like a diagram suggesting something, almost like a symbol. And he does that with his graphics. What is the absolute minimum I need to make this shot work? What's the absolute minimum I need to make this film work? So he's a master. I think at his best, he is like super economic. If he doesn't have to use color, he won't. If he doesn't have to use people, he won't use people like in Renaissance or something like that. And that I think is very different from Gilliam. But at the same time, a film like Time Bandits and Gavotte, they both have dwarves. They're both funny. And I think there is a continuity, and why not? It's that humor, that mentality. That's what they share. The fact that they're both fine artists who just happen to be working in film. And they both have a particular humorous way of looking at the world in all of its horrors. And that's another thing I think Gilliam and Borowczyk share, the fact that what is funny one moment is horrific the next, and they don't offer signposts as to the tonal shift. And that's particularly the case in something like Brazil. When the end of Brazil, it gets quite frightening. Or in the case of Dr. Jekyll by Borowczyk, when you don't know if it's the funniest film you've ever seen or the most horrific film you've ever seen. I think there are continuities.
Can we talk about the humour in Goto? Because I said it's weirdly dark, but it is also, I think that's one of the things I love about Borowczyk. I always get this sense sometimes that he's sticking a finger up at these very bourgeois, pretentious sort of ideas, and you find this humour in there. Anarchic humour, and there's a lot of it in Goto. I said it's like quite a dark film, but there's also some really funny parts to it because of the absurdity, and it's also very sensual as well. You get the little peekaboo looking in on women and their bottoms and stuff, and it's all a bit cheeky. So it never gets too dark to be this thesis on, like this very dark. We were talking about The Fifth Horseman is Fear recently, which is great, but it's just very dark, very stern. And within something like Goto, I think that's why my memory of it was that it was far more whimsical. That was the emotion I took away from it. And then watching it back this time, I thought, actually, there's some really dark things in this that were just standing out more, I think, because of the current climate.
It's difficult to describe and characterize the tone of Goto. For me personally, I'm not sure if it's whimsical, but at the same time, it does have this kind of fantastic, fanciful atmosphere in terms of the way it's kind of presenting this world. But it's a very melancholic film.
That was my takeaway from watching it. When did that box set come out? A few years ago. That was the emotion that I remembered from it. And then watching back, I thought, this isn't actually that whimsical. Although it is still, parts of it are funny as well. It is a strange one. It's like it shifts all over the place. And it is very sad, like Blanche as well. But I think that's what I love about those two films.
One thing which doesn't really get pointed out enough about Borowczyk is that, everyone always talks about him being an erotic filmmaker, and he always used to say, I'm not an erotic filmmaker, because the whole business of an erotic film is to titillate. And, yes, some of these films are sexually explicit, the famous ones, but the other ones aren't. But if there is one thread which I think you could trace through all of his works with one or two notable exceptions, is that he is a comic filmmaker. Most of the short films are engineered around getting some gags in, not unlike silent films, which of course has a bearing on the tone, humor, and look of Goto. He is a comic filmmaker. The Beast it's a farce. Dr. Jekyll, it's, I don't know, a Sadian farce. Is that a new genre?
Yeah, it's a total
but Assad is kind of funny as well in its own horrific way. And so these are all, But in the case of like probably something, my favorite of the shorts is one called Angel's Games, and that's definitely not funny. It's a film which goes out of its way to say that it's not about the concentration camps. But although there's nothing in the film to make that explicit, the fact that the film at the beginning says this film should not be confused with anything that happened, it clearly is about the kind of the camp experience, and there isn't much humor in that situation. And Goto is, there are funny moments in terms of the characterization. I think the way in which like all of these are kind of old kind of military type people, that he casts to type, so these people look like the characters they play, and then he sort of accentuates these characteristics through costume. So all of these kind of people who are bald and these tiny kind of glasses, like kind of professors, or the guy with the kind of the earpiece because he's deaf. That's his humor, I think, and it's almost pantomime like.
Well, fighting over fly catching and stuff. All the stuff with the flies I find really funny. Just the fact that somebody would be that into catching flies, and it becomes this really absurd. I just find it funny. I find Dr. Jekyll. I mean, me and Sam just did an episode on Dr. Jekyll, which hopefully is going to air soon, and we were just laughing about that film. Just, laughing about the absurdity of the situations. I think that's one of his greatest strengths. I think in terms of the sexuality, it's a very innocent sense of sexuality that's also funny. Like some of the shots in Goto, like the women in the brothel and spying in binoculars, were almost like those images you get on the saucy postcards. There's this sense of innocence about them. And even in his later stuff, actually, even in stuff like The Beast, it's not entirely serious. It's not, like you said, it's not erotic in the sense that, then he's making a film to commercially titillate people. It's just all part of this same thing, which is humorous and it's very warm. And I think that's how, he's an incredibly accessible filmmaker because of that.
Well, you mentioned the brothel scene. I mean, this is something which is always, it's always made me think, what exactly are we looking at? I mean, are women on the island of Goto nationalized?
Yeah.
Is it sort of like, because it doesn't feel like a private establishment. It feels like some sort of state-run brothel, which I've always treated it as like a combination of both Borowczyk's fantasy, but also almost a satire of, aspects of communist life. The idea, I think, how could you take nationalization to the most absurd possible level? And so you actually have when we nationalize women, and then of course the actual makeup. I mean, it does look incredible, that kind of long shot when you've got just all those iron baths and those kind of contraptions allowing the water to go in. I mean, it does look fantastic. Everything in that work, there is this whole nostalgic element of Borowczyk, and which everything, all the kind of the visual iconography seems to be drawn or tend to the kind of the end of the 19th century. So you have this. I mean, someone described it. I think at some point said Borowczyk is the ultimate hipster director, and I thought, God, what do you mean that? And what they meant was the fact that he was really into kind of vintage stuff. That's what they meant. And it's true. It's sort of like, here's somebody who doesn't want anything mass produced, who just wants vintage things. Someone who literally does art direction himself by routing through a thrift store. Someone who literally does his costumes by taking Pete Bolsher, who's his costume person, to a flea market, and then just like a collage, grabbing this and that and adapting things.
Well, his obsession with lace and corsets, because I'm a sucker for costumes, especially period costumes. And obviously that's a theme but so many fucking corsets and lace, especially in that brothel scene. I just absolutely love all that stuff, and the way he frames it as well. So it does become sensual and erotic in that way, I guess, if you're like me and you're into that sort of thing.
It's like sensual in the true meaning of the word, whereby it's appealing to the senses. So it's not just kind of like, what's like in peeping Tom Scoptophilia or whatever, when they talk about this, it's like everything, the idea that the attention to the sounds, the attention to the texture of surfaces, the attention to things like the color itself. And I think that's something which is very important in Goto, whereby the film is black and white and color, but the way in which he uses color, it's very different from, say, Tarkovsky or Lindsay Anderson in If. He just uses color as like a punctuation or underlining something by shifting to color just for a close-up of like the Glossier's blue shoes or the meat of the dogs or the blood in the bucket. And you're thinking, well, this is that immediate shock of color. It's something you don't have time to think about because the shots are so short. So they work primarily on like a sensual level. And, just like almost like it's like a William Castle effect. It's just like shot corridor with the color sequence and that. It's just like a device to, which works on the senses.
I love the way that the storytelling is actually completed. Just the whole idea of the schoolroom that we have at the beginning, and they have the whole thing. I love whenever we talk about perspectives, they've got that photo or that artwork that is the three go-tos that are all in one, but the teacher is asking the different sides of the classroom what they're looking at. And I like that they see something that we don't, at least at first, and that when they are saying, I see Goto 1, I see Goto 2, I see Goto 3, and it's just like, well, what are you talking about? And then finally he moves, the professor moves the picture around, and we get to see that it is one picture with three people in it. And of course, this being Easter, I'm thinking of the Trinity, and just like, are these just the same person, basically just three different aspects of leadership or the governance of the island? That whole idea of the classroom and all of the things that are in the classroom, we keep talking about all of the objects and the wonderful image of the fly life cycle that is up on the board, and that he's teaching the children about flies. And then it's also a nice way to bring us into the story too and give us this whole idea of Goto being an island that has been cut off since 1887. And I was trying to find out, was there some sort of significance to January 12th, 1887? Was that something special in history? But I was unable to find out anything in particular where I was like, oh, okay, there was something that happened on that date.
It's genius how he gets, because he introduces us to this completely fantasy world. And in that single scene, using the prop of the three emperors or governors, the Goto guys, he just gives us all this exposition in a couple of minutes that we now suddenly understand how everything is set up on that island. And it goes back to what Daniel was saying about economy. It's genius when you look at, because often when you're trying to do fantasy, and I've been trying to write a fantasy novel, and it's so difficult not to overload people with exposition, but you, at the same time, you're trying to present something that's not like our world. So it's like, how do you do that? And the way he does that visually and drawing us in with the school children, so that the school children tell us this history. You don't feel weighted down with all this kind of history of the island. It's just done so quickly and so beautifully in a way that you engage with it as well. Because like you said, Mike, you can't see the other Gotos initially. I just think it's just fucking amazing storytelling.
There's so much in that scene. I mean, you could think that usually, another filmmaker may just turn that into like a credit roll at the beginning of just in the context. But there's so many visual things which you make inferences from. It's like the teacher with the kind of the greasy hair and the stubble and the glasses. It's conjuring up so many associations, that kind of Eastern European, kind of Polish pre-war Habsburg, that kind of period, sort of like a pre-war sort of, is it the early 20th century or the late 19th century? Is it an Eastern European country? Is it kind of like more of a German country, or is it, what is this? It's not clear, but there are little things which suggest it. And then you look at all the school children, and they're all wearing the same militaristic costumes, and you automatically start thinking of kind of military dictatorships or sort of like kind of communist uniform aspects. And then this trinity, which of course does have this religious connotations, but then that aspect is also in kind of Soviet life, the cult of personality of Stalin, the way that basically you have an ideology which has no space for religious thought. At the same time, the tyrants are kind of exalted and treated with exactly the same kind of structure as a religion. And so it's almost like, a commentary on that aspect of kind of communist or particularly Stalinist life. The fact that last year I was in Armenia working on an installation featuring Parajanov's outtakes, and we were in this incredible cinema which was made in the 70s in this kind of brutalist, futuristic fashion. But we were using the foyer, and the foyer had stained glass windows, and steps in this kind of scale, which were clearly either inspired or drawing or associating with the church. And so you have this strange mixture. We're in what was a communist country with communist architecture, but at the same time it looks like a religious church. And so I think that those early scenes are the way that, yes, this isn't a religious community in the normal sense, but you still have funerals, you have these weird rituals, there's kind of executions, and then you have this kind of military leader. It's drab and run down, the way that people are not clean shaven, and everything's a bit tatty and a bit worn. You're not sure when it happened. Is it, what time are we in? I mean, Borowczyk makes it clear that it's a story of the present. So, it's, I think it's an incredible scene. And also you don't see any establishing shots. The establishing shots that there is in Blanche. When the title sequence, you've got the castle, and that's kind of intercut with the dove and Blanche herself. But in the case of Goto, there's not one establishing shot. We do not see the exterior of the building. And I think that's really interesting from an editing point of view, the fact that Borowczyk, like a lot of Czech filmmakers, which Kat's covered an awful lot of, is that it's like, guys, we don't need the establishing shot. This isn't a Hollywood movie. We can just junk the establishing shot, and then we can create a space using these different locations. And it doesn't have to necessarily be a space which makes sense. And that's something which you very much get a feeling of at the end of the film, the way that when he's dragging what appears to be the lifeless body of Glossier through an endless procession of kind of trapdoors and things like this, and you're thinking, how big is this kind of fortress? How many floors does it have? And you realize it doesn't matter. That's part of the fun of the film, and it's the same with the Dutch Jackal film. You kind of create this kind of Piranesi dungeon of kind of stairs and tunnels and chutes, and you use editing to kind of create this kind of nonsensical mess. And because you don't know what the castle looks like from the outside, your brain is constantly adjusting, and whatever's in your brain is far more impressive than probably what you could do with a model shot or these days a CGI effect.
Well, it reminds me of those people who would desperately try and work out the Overlook Hotel in The Shining. They're like, it doesn't make sense. And it's the same thing with The Shining, in that you have this hotel that we get to see what it looks like from the outside, but on the inside, you're just in this whole labyrinth, which is part of the effect. You get lost in it, but you have these people that are just so hung up on logic and things having to make sense that it drives them crazy, and I love that. It's like, let it go. Just the whole idea is, I think with this film, you're put into this space, but instinctively you start to understand it very early on. You don't need to, like Daniel said, you don't need to have the established. Like if it was a Hollywood film, you would get in a land far, far away in 1887, like you'd get this whole thing, and then you'd get like shots of the island, and you really don't need that, because it's such a, like I said, a tactile film, and a film that's very sensual. You feel it. You don't need to know any of those other things. You don't need to know them. You understand this world perfectly from that very first scene in, just a schoolroom, looking at this picture and talking about flies. It's so utterly genius. But if you imagine that in a pitch meeting, like for a more conventional thing, well, what happens? Well, they talk about these flies and they talk, it would seem absolutely nonsensical to, if you start to try and put it in any logical space.
I think that's one of the, I won't say problems, but it's a problem Borowczyk had, because, I've got the script for Blanche, the film he made afterwards, and there's, of course, you can read through the script and you can, and the film follows the script pretty perfectly, but there's nothing in the script to give the suggestion of how he's going to construct this visually. There's nothing to suggest, how he's going to cut to these close-ups and things like that, and the way he frames and hones in on details. So I think that, it's an issue which I think would be a problem for Borowczyk later on in his career, when some of his scripts were either given more scrutiny, or the people giving the money just didn't know what he did. If you look at like one of the earlier shorts, which I think it's one of the best ones, it's called Rosalie. And
that's one of my favourites. I love that.
It's incredible, and I think that that's a really good short film to kind of get to grips with how Borowczyk tells stories and uses objects to tell stories, because it's based on a Maupassant story about a kind of a housemaid, which the master of the house gets her pregnant, and she gives birth to two children secretly, panics, and then smothers them and buries them outside. And it sounds absolutely horrific. Of course it is horrific, but what does Borowczyk do? He kind of presents the film as a confessional, and so you have this panelled background with Ligia staring directly into the camera. In many ways, she's composed the same way in Goto. And she tells the story, and then basically Borowczyk cuts to objects which are kind of laid out as pieces of evidence. And of course, you are being presented with these objects, but because of the narrative, you are imagining how those objects feature in the story which is happening off screen. So when you see a spade, of course, all you see in the film is a spade with some soil on and a kind of a label identifying it as evidence. But of course, when she's telling the story about burying the children, of course, you see in your head all this drama happening off screen. So he's able to basically tell stories through objects. And I think that's very much the case with the school at the beginning, because you have all this exposition, which Kat mentions, and then you see this kind of cabinet of curiosities with all these objects inside. But of course, the context, all that exposition influences and changes the way you think about those objects. So all of these objects have great symbolic significance, and it's not that they're not kind of like symbols for something abstract. They're quite concrete in what they symbolize. If you see, like in the Rosalie short, if you see a bundle, it's obviously the children inside. It's like a symbol in a much more kind of fundamental way, nothing fancy.
We were talking a little bit about the religious symbolism and just that everything is an ascension. We have so many things that are up high in this, and I don't know if that's because of what happened in 1887 and that we have to take to the heights, but just that even when we're introduced to Grozo and the other criminal that he's got to fight, that there's this ascension up this elevator, and everything seems to be taking place upstairs or in elevators or up elevators. And even when it comes to the area where they have to fight at, there's also a stairway there, so that we've got Goto above everybody else, so that he and Glosia have to look down at the rest of it. And it seems like all the nobles are up there and all the riffraff is down on the floor. And we were talking about the humor. The whole thing of the fight that they have, it looks like something that Charlie Chaplin would do. The very large man who, of course, can kick Charlie Chaplin's ass, but we get some good bops on the head going on with this. I'm not sure what the rules of this game are as far as why one person's head is covered and the other one's given a stick, but it works out for me watching it.
Well, my interpretation was the guy, because he killed, he gets a bag over his head. But because Grotto only stole a pair of binoculars, he gets a stick. And of course, it may be, I don't know, I'm just guessing here, but it's leveling out the odds just to make it more entertaining, because I guess it's more about entertainment than law and order, which I guess is another way in which the film resonates with the climate we're in right now, particularly in the States, Never mind justice. Is it entertaining or not?
Yeah.
Were the ratings good?
I was number one on Facebook, and I just found out I'm number one on Facebook. I thought that was very nice.
For a long time, when asked, okay, what are your influences, it was very clear that Borowczyk was not he was not a cinephile, and he wasn't like, when he got his camera, he wasn't making homages to Hitchcock or something like that. He was interested in the camera itself, so he usually, when he got asked who were your favorite filmmakers, he would say Chaplin, Keaton, Eisenstein, Vittorio De Sica, and Méliès, and Emile Cole, and Reno. And for a long time, I thought, well, these are almost get out of jail type answers. Who doesn't like Chaplin? Who doesn't like Keaton? But when you think about it, all of these filmmakers, with the exception of Eisenstein and definitely De Sica, these are all silent filmmakers. Eisenstein, of course, is half and half, but these are all silent filmmakers, and I think it's a really important way of looking at his films whereby, and I don't want to sound like Peter Greenaway, who was incidentally of that generation of people who were very influenced by Borowczyk's shorts in particular, but the basic idea which Greenaway goes on and on about, you can see very much in Borowczyk's work. It's just that Greenaway articulates it better, whereas I think Borowczyk puts it into practice much more effectively. And that is the feeling that in many ways something in cinema died with the introduction of sound in 1927. As soon as we came to a technological point whereby we could just film theatre, that whole visual language, which encompassed pantomime, encompassed music, all of that was lost. Chaplin and Keaton are the double pinnacle of that period in many ways. I think you have this 40 years later, so in 1967, 1968, you have three films which I think are equally significant. They're completely different in many ways, but you have 2001: A Space Odyssey, The Color of Pomegranates, and you have Goto, Island of Love. And you have three filmmakers effectively making silent films. And what they're doing is what Eisenstein said we should do with Alexandrov and Pudovkin, with his statement on sound in 1928. Said, look, we have to be careful not to film theatre. What we have to do is think of an association between the soundtrack and the image with the same innovation and imagination as we have with montage films of the 1920s. So you have people like Kubrick making 2001, which has even got title cards when you think about it. There's hardly any dialogue, but music dictates much of the film or serves as a counterpoint. You're having a similar thing with Parajanov with The Color of Pomegranates, that simplification, that return to pantomime, doing away with narrative in a conventional sense. And you have the same with Goto, the idea of let's go back to the silent era, but give it a modern twist. Let's go back to the simplicity of communicating a world, an atmosphere of feeling, but let's not be lazy. Let's not put this in dialogue or explain it. Let's show it. And I think it really, you end up with this acting, which is not realistic. It's not like stylized pantomime, but it's very, very expressive. And you have that, I think it's very clear in the scene when Goto and Glossier go to the beach and they're playing peekaboo. It's ridiculous, but it really does underline the tone and feeling which Borowczyk is after. It's
weird you're saying this, actually, because I just wrote an essay on that most important thing is to love, about this very thing with Żuławski as well. And I'm not saying that stylistically or tonally they made the same films, but I wrote about how in silent film, body language and expression and what we'd see as melodramatic overacting now, everything is exaggerated, was pretty much the entire language of cinema. And when sound comes along, it becomes this intellectual property. People start to think we can raise the bar and we can put cinema on a par with theatre, which was always considered the more serious form of, the more intellectual, the more bourgeois form of entertainment. And when that comes along, things that are strictly physical or tactile or purely visual, they somehow become lesser in that because they don't have this. So with Żuławski, it's like the incredibly over-the-top melodrama, the expressive acting, the fact that things aren't told in words or logical words. They're told in screams and in crying and just this very, very over-the-top way that somehow, when we get that sound shift, becomes something that is considered lowbrow, or, you know, we have to be very intellectual now. It's all about the script. It's all about the dialogue. It's all about this narrative meaning. And I love some of the early sound films. I absolutely love screwball comedies, for example. I really love pre-code films. So I love the use of language in film. But I think the fact that language and clever dialogue, we lost so much because of that. You know, the expressive, it suddenly gets seen as being too expressive or too exaggerated or too strange, becomes seen as a bad thing. And it all has to be explained. We lose that very instinctive visual thing that maybe it's not realistic, but we can respond to that in a way, because it's very emotion based. And so looking at a film like Goto, also very emotion based. There's so many emotions in the film. There's, like you said, there's sadness, there's this sense of romance, but this very, very doomed romance that's very sad. There's a lot of physical comedy. And so you could watch that film without absolutely any dialogue, no subtitles or anything, and still understand it on some level, I think, which you couldn't do with a film that was people sat in a room talking about their lives. You just couldn't do that.
One of the advantages I had, and it was an advantage like 20, 25 years ago, is seeing films like Żuławski's films or Gierman's films because I didn't know. I mean, they weren't subtitled. You know, I didn't know Polish or Russian. So, of course, your appreciation of those films is purely, to use your word, like, you know, sensual. You're looking at bodies in space. You're listening to the musicality of the voices, the intonation. So, of course, you're making inferences constantly about what the hell's going on in the scene based on whether people are screaming or not, or whether, you know, they've got their clothes on or they've ripped them off or something like this. And I think that was really helpful in terms of appreciating both filmmakers. And I think that conversely, I think a lot of the reasons why particularly Żuławski was very unpopular until relatively recently in Poland is because people, that dialogue's terrible. Oh my God.
It's that thing, isn't it?
And you're listening to the film. You're listening to the film rather than looking at it. Yeah. And I think that really, and paradoxically, the physicality of both, and I think that they have many similar things in terms of the context in which they work, the way that they worked on the fringes or across genre, but they were very different people and characters, Żuławski and Borowczyk. But the one thing which I think that the most important thing is they really have a sense of kind of physical embodiment. The fact that intellectually, I think in the West, if you are going to intellectualize this, you talk about language as a system as opposed to the spoken word. And I think the combination of various cultural and theatre traditions, and not just Poland, but the East, when you combine that with a lot of ideas in the Soviet Union in the 20s, the idea emphasis constantly on the spoken word. So the idea of gesture, how you say. I mean, the reason there was so much kind of emphasis on this is because talking about language is a social phenomenon, something which you're going to be advising people. How do they give speeches? How do they motivate workers? Why does this person have this effect? Or, why could you end up with a situation with someone who's a great speaker reading the same text as someone who's a bad speaker reading the same text? And the good speaker makes a huge impression, but the bad speaker who said exactly the same content, the same words, says it very weakly and unconvincingly. So I think that there's this whole emphasis constantly on the embodiment of the story. How do you visualize it? How do you physicalize it? And then, how those bodies actually can relate to the story itself. Are they physically interesting and not just beautiful? Are they aging in a particularly interesting way? I mean, there's some quite gnarly and freakish looking people in Goto, and it's all the better for it.
You talked about how you could watch Goto without any sort of sound or dialogue, and so much of this movie is just about looks. And I think it was very telling that Goto was a thief because he stole binoculars, and that we have these scenes and these towers, especially Glossia and Gono. Yeah, that's a thing. All the G's are a thing. Where they are in this tower, and it seems like each window they look out of is completely different. One seems to show them the ocean. One shows them the mountains. One shows them the forest. And it just depends on which way they look will show them these completely different scenes, which is absolutely unrealistic, but I love that that's the way that this movie works, and that it is the moment when Goto later on in the film gives Goto the binoculars again, that is kind of leads to his empowerment when he actually ends up murdering Goto and tries to take over the whole shebang and make Glossia his wife now.
It's interesting in terms of the way in which those three objects, those three roles, and the way that the governor gives him the job of the looking after cleaning the shoes, looking after the dogs, and as a fly, how all of those kind of objects and those jobs play a role in the kind of the storytelling process. And I think also this way of cutting at these 90-degree angles, it allows him to very easily to create this just geography of the island. There's no continuity problems, because if you're restricting yourself to this kind of flat on look, and then you're progressing, you're cutting to an adjacent shot, you can actually create this without painting yourself into a corner editorially, and the place can have as many beaches and as quarries as it wants. It's kind of like chess in a way.
The position of the binoculars and this thing that the powerful man has possession of the binoculars is really fascinating as well, because he can see everything, and it's like the binoculars are forbidden. I like that scene just before he kills him, where he's like, you can look through the binoculars, and he's acting like it's a trick. Like somehow binoculars are this forbidden thing that, only certain people are privileged to. And I just really love those little details that tell us so much about the power structure on Goto. And he was privileged to do what, like Mike said, the level, people are up on high as well, and people are lower down. The way he uses that physical space just to tell us about how the society is ordered. But the binoculars thing really fascinates me, because, it's like, are they the only binoculars on the island? Like, why are they so, why are they so dangerous? Why are they so important? And it's incredible. But then, like you said, he then uses that to show us parts of the island as well. So everything has a function. It goes back to what we were saying right at the beginning about it being art, but not this kind of intellectual detached art. Everything is very practical. Everything is pure art on one level, but it's also very practical. Everything has a very, very down-to-earth practical meaning, which I love. Because often when you see some filmmakers who are going for the big intellectual statement, they will put objects in as motifs, which are fucking pointless. It's just smoke and mirrors. It's just absolutely pointless. But in Goto, everything actually has a very practical meaning of being there. And so, like Daniel said, on any level, you can understand that. You can understand the binoculars are important, and they have this particular meaning. And I just absolutely love that part about it because it feels very grounded in that way, very earthy, very down to earth.
Well, I think that really is Borowczyk's legacy in many ways, because I know it gets the headlines, the talented guy who ended up making soft porn, so to speak, but I think the real legacy is that he gave a generation of people, particularly in England and also France, of artists, the possibility of saying, look, you can use film in a narrative fashion. And certainly in the UK, I mean, Goto was the key film in that respect, in terms of you had Raymond Dergnat, who wrote an excellent, very long article for Film Comment in 1976 called Borowczyk and the Cartoon Renaissance, which we included in the Camera Obscura book. And at the time, Ray was teaching, he was a tutor at both St. Martin's College of Art and the Royal College of Art. So, of course, he was screening this as part of showing films to students of painting, students of photography, so not necessarily film students. And you had the Quay brothers at the Royal College of Art. You had Craigie Horsfield, the photographer I mentioned. You had a photographer called John Goto, who liked the film so much he changed his name. And you had Andrzej Klimovsky, who became and is a fantastic poster designer. Who, I've commissioned him to do posters for not only Story of Sin but also Hard to Be a God and Cristalli of My Car. So all of those students were kind of exposed to Goto and Raymond Dergnat's particularly framing of it. And what Borowczyk was really showing is that, you can actually use film as a medium for other works. So if you're a painter, you can make those paintings move. If you're a photographer, well, film is made up of 24 frames a second, but what is the relationship between those frames? If you're a sculptor, I mean, can you give a story to a sculptor? This is conceptual art in its very kind of rudimentary form. There's a surrealist novel called Locus Solus by Raymond Roussel, and the basic plot is someone going to a country estate where they're kind of given a tour of all these increasingly surrealistic and bizarre contraptions, but with an explanation as to their workings. So, in fact, this is like installation work. This is conceptual art, but it's done in an entertaining, bizarre fashion. And you could draw a parallel between that's kind of what Borowczyk's doing with Goto, in a way that you're being given a guided tour through this kind of island, which is a bit like, I don't know, North Korea. It could be a bit like Austria in the 19th century. It could be all of these things, but you're given a tour and you're given all these objects have a story. These fly catchers are there because of this plague of flies, this bizarre guillotine type execution device. It says something about the penal system and on this island, and also the fact that the way that the coffins are kind of shot down as if it's at the sea. All of this is kind of evoked. And so this possibility of giving artists, people not necessarily working in film, but working in other mediums, a way of telling stories using their particular area, I think that's something which, Goto is really important in that respect.
Yeah, I don't know what it was about this time, but as I was watching this, I kept thinking of 100 Years of Solitude by who's that, Marquez, and just how that isolation creates this whole different society, and that was coming out in 1967. So it's like something in the air was just like, okay, let's talk about these isolated communities and how things can go wrong with them. And, you're talking about it could be this country, it could be that country, but it's like those those things were being explored. And I do have to apologize. I said at the beginning, this Polish month, and Daniel was gracious enough to point out that Borowczyk may be a Polish filmmaker, but this is a French film, and that he had been in France since 1958. So this isn't technically a Polish film. So we'll lump it in with the 1969 series if that counts.
This is, I think, when film critics and film historians should not be too anal, frankly, because here is a film which is conceived in Poland by a Pole who has endured the Polish experience, and yet he makes the film in France. The film is then banned in Poland and in Franco Spain, which, of course, it was, the whole situation in Poland is they didn't ban film. They bought the film and didn't distribute it. But
it's very passive-aggressive way of doing
exactly.
It.
They did this with Blanche as well. And so you have, how do you deal with these filmmakers? And I think that certainly something I noticed in the 90s, you had these people, primarily Borowczyk and Żuławski, who were basically too Polish for French film histories and too French for Polish film histories. And that isn't helped by people like Zanussi, the Polish filmmaker, by saying, well, Borowczyk, they were really French. They were really French. So you have all these questions here about what is the nationality of the film? Is the nationality important? Is it the country in which it's made? Is it the credit? Is it the director? Is it important? I mean, I've always thought of Borowczyk and Żuławski as Polish emigres. They are people who lived and worked abroad. I mean, it's like Joseph Conrad or, all of these people. The film Goto is shot partly in the ruins of Marie Curie's laboratory on the outskirts of France. And of course, Marie Curie's Polish. But she made these discoveries in France. And like Chopin, a lot of people think that Chopin and Marie Curie are French. How important is this national thing? And if we ascribe importance to it, it kind of takes us down a road whereby we look at Goto as a political allegory, whereas on the other hand, a lot of other people were seeing it, like Angela Carter was seeing it as a fairy tale, which of course ties in with magic realism. Żuławski, he wrote a very interesting article in Positive magazine in the 1980s, and he said something which I think applies both to his cinema, but also Borowczyk. He said that, with Fellini, Fellini opened a chapter of film history whereby he found the fantastic and the miraculous in everyday life, which of course is the same thesis of magic realism. But he then said that, well, he thought the next chapter in film history is making the absurd and the strange and fantastic realistic. And of course that is a very good way of looking at possession. I mean, you have a monster in your bed and you just treat it as a soap opera. And, it's no longer a thing in a Spielberg movie. It's something you have to deal with during your divorce. And a similar thing with Borowczyk and the idea that you talked about the strange instruments at the beginning. Yes, it's bizarre, it's off-center, it's off-kilter, but you kind of get what you get from that. It's something a bit like a cello. And you have, in the film, you have all of these strange, slightly off-putting, bizarre things, but at the same time, you kind of get, this is an execution, this is this is mourning, this is a school, this is a sort of weird communist brothel. So you have this kind of what seems to be surrealistic and very kind of bizarre and strange, but at the same time, no matter how strange it is, it's also a very familiar film.
It's interesting you bring up Angela Carter, actually, because I'm working on one of my many book projects on a book of erotic stories, and Mike's read one of them, that are inspired by, not based on, both the work of Angela Carter and Borowczyk, called The Chamber of Beasts, because I see so many connections between Borrow and Carter, especially their obsession with animals. And you with the flies in this, but the obsession of animals to do with sexuality. So it's probably a very niche erotic book, but it's the only one I can write. So there is definitely this sense of magical realism in Goto. But in a lot of Borowczyk's films, And you can see how Carter was obviously influenced by that. She was obviously influenced by Czech cinema as well. And I grew up reading Carter and came to the films later on. So it's amazing how many connections I then find. And look at things and think she'd obviously seen this. She was obviously inspired by that. And Neil Jordan as well, who did Carter's, one of the only film adaptations of Andrew Carter's work, Company of Wolves. One of his favourite films, and I found this 90s interview with him, I think it might have been in Film Comment. He talks about some of his guilty pleasures. I fucking hate that phrase. But one of his favourite films was Blanche, and it just makes so much sense when you watch something like The Company of Wolves, how much influence filmmakers like Borowczyk and even things like the Saragossa manuscript, these people, they weren't taking their gothic horror from something really obvious. They would go into these Eastern European, more surreal, and it's just like this pinnacle there, and all the lights come on, and you're just like, wow, it's all fucking connected.
In the case of Angela Carter, I mean, she wrote, and it's well known that she regularly went to what was then the National Film Theatre, and so she was a voracious cinephile, and I know that when they did the film adaptation of The Magic Toy Shop, she made the director look at Valerie in A Week of Wonders, and I know that the reference for the structure of the Company of Wolves adaptation was the Saragossa manuscript, and it doesn't work as well in the way that the Saragossa manuscript works, which is amazing, but the idea of actually having stories within stories within stories, clearly comes from that. And I think that, there's no question that the Beast obviously has a strong parallel with many of the ideas in particularly the film, The Company of Wolves. And Neil Jordan, I think his guilty pleasure, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was L'Image, and nothing really guilty about Blanche.
I found another one where he talked about Blanche as well. So he's obviously a big fan.
He certainly is, and I think that it's in the case of when you look at that, what he was doing in The Company of Wolves, and I think that it's where were those references, inspirations, and I think it's also the fact that Company of Wolves was one of the first productions of Palace Pictures, which of course grew out of the Scala cinema. And of course, Borowczyk's films were a kind of a mainstay of the Scala programming because they were perfect, functioning both as kind of art films and also, exploitation films, because that's how Borowczyk's films were distributed in the UK. The later ones, they were distributed by a distributor called New Realm, which also distributed Possession, but they were not, they made their money, I think, distributing Emmanuel, but they were not art film distributors.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. When you read something like Carter's The Bloody Chamber, you can see so much of Borowczyk in this idea of women transcending and becoming beasts and things like that. There's a definite, and when I finally finish this book, I want to do like an introductory essay exploring all this fascination with animals, and Carter was so obsessed with objects as well.
When did she write The Sadian Woman? When did she write that one?
78, I think.
Yeah, because that was after she came back or during the time she was in Japan. Was that right?
Yeah.
So, but it is interesting when you actually have, and I think this is in this particular climate with a lot of the discussions happening about sexuality in films, about how these films are made. And I think if you contrast the debate which is taking place at the moment with the debate that was taking place, let's say, immediately after 1968, which of course is the year Goto was produced, you have a slightly more nuanced feminists who are kind of quoting Simone de Beauvoir, and you had Angela Carter saying, well, look, okay, whatever you say about Dessard, at least he recognized women as something other than baby-making machines.
Yeah.
And so sexuality is something to be embraced. And I think that you had Pauline Réage, the author of The Story of O. You're having this is treated as kind of like great literature in France, and you're having Graham Greene saying that this is literature. So there was this kind of plurality, different feminisms and different approaches to sexuality, and of course I think a film like Goto, and particularly Blanche, it is interesting in the way that basically in Blanche, literally the film is about a bunch of men kind of shifting around a kind of a hopeless object. I mean, Blanche has no possibility in the social structure. She can't do anything. She's just a perpetual victim. But her beauty and her awakens this inherently aggressive sexuality in all the men around her, and brings about this disaster. So she's like a catalyst for this disaster, but at the same time, it's not blaming her for it. It's just that her beauty, her everything is the flame which starts this fire. And it's exactly the same in Goto, in the idea that you realize that Goto, I mean, at the end of the story is about a thieving little shit who understands the system in which he lives, and he proceeds to manipulate that system to try and get what he wants, and he doesn't get it. So you could say, on the one hand, this is a film made by a Pole in France in 1968. So, of course, the Poles saw that this bastard's making fun of what it's like to live in communist Poland, because communist Poland, as is contemporary Poland, it's full of corruption and kind of cronyism and incompetence. And so you could actually look at the film as almost like a satire on this kind of atrophying. They even called the 1960s in Poland the stabilization period under Gomulka. So you could look at the film as some sort of comment on this kind of stasis where the utopian vision is ground to a halt, and we're just kind of locked into this repeating Sisyphus-like cycle where nothing actually happens. It's a bit like today. Will this kind of lockdown situation which we're all in, will it ever end? And all the days blur into one. So you could look at the film in a political way in Poland, but at the same time, it's not limited to that. It's so much more. And I think the idea of the film as a sort of fairy tale structure, that's what excited Angela Carter. Yeah. Marina Warner writes about it, Goto in The Beast of the Blonde, along with Blanche. So you're having these films which mean something for different people. And of course, the very people who kind of celebrated these type of films as fairy tales about what it's like to be a woman in this situation. I mean, tough drama. There is that element to those films, and I think that's what was interesting to Angela Carter. But of course, a few years later, when feminism, a more aggressive kind adopted by somebody like Andrea Dworkin, which has no kind of room at all for the idea of any form of pornography, that whatever is deemed pornography is inherently bad and destructive. So, and then of course, now we're back in a situation of this kind of puritanical view in which basically the feminism associated with Angela Carter and Simone de Beauvoir and all these people is considered old and wrong.
Yeah, see, that is why I respond to Borowczyk's films so much. And I know certain quarters have called him misogynist or they've misread the films. But the one thing that I initially responded to in his films was this very Carter-esque sexuality, which she was obviously influenced by these things that we've been talking about. But this idea that he would often expose the systems that oppress women, he would expose double standards, he tended to view women's sexuality as this very pure thing that was contained by these corrupt, male, oppressive or class-based structures. And then you get to something like Dr. Jekyll, which is incredibly perverse and transgressive. And that's all about the strength of female sexuality. So I think we often seek to like oppress women's sexuality because it is so powerful. And he understood that, but it's like we either desexualize women completely or we make the sexualization of women this terrible crime instead of accepting, you know, the idea that women can be sexual. And even in something like Goto, we see Glossier is somebody who has her own sense of sexuality. And her trajectory is she just wants to be involved in this love affair. She just wants to see her lover, and obviously she's punished for that in some way by a jealous man, or potentially about to be punished by one jealous man, and then another jealous man takes over. So away from the political things, the reason I always come back to this film is that fairy tale quality and the very sort of female, feminine, sexual elements that are in all of his films. They're not, you get this idea, you know, Borowczyk, the pornographer, you know, he's looking at women's bottoms and, you know, he's objectifying women, but I've never felt that from his films. What I see in his films are women that are trying to be free, and often they become free and they're able to unleash that. You see it in Convent Walls, for example. So you get this sense of women trying to be free. And so it's not this commercial pornography that is just, you know, made to titillate a certain audience. It's not about that. I think it goes a lot deeper than that. And I think in that respect, he was very pro-women. I can see why Carter responded to that, because if we read The Sardian Woman, it's all about that. And she's got that famous quote about Desardes, you know, whatever you want to say about him, he argued for a woman's right to fuck and to fuck her way into history. And, you know, so it's that same sense of that Cartian sort of feminism that I see in these films that often gets blown aside, you know, by people talking about feminism, and they automatically say, oh, this is a man and he's objectifying women and he's just doing it for his own obsessions. I think it goes a lot deeper than that.
I think that the problem with those whole debates is the fact that, I think the problem with the word feminism is the same problem as the word pornography, in the way that they mean nothing. I mean, you have to explain what you mean by them so that the person you're having the conversation with is aware of the terms in which those. And I think that the question, which is, I think it's an important distinction, is sexuality as a subject as opposed to a means to an end, the end being.
Well, it's part of life, isn't it? Sexuality is part of life. And Borowczyk has always framed it as just part of life, part of existence. Yeah, Pasolini was the same. Fellini, and I'm broached on Fellini, but I see similar things in Fellini as well. Between Borowczyk and Fellini, of course, Fellini was really humorous as well, and would often find humour in very dark, absurd subject matter. And somebody who saw things very visually, like Fellini would always start, and he started as an artist in comics as well, and would always start his ideas for his films with a picture that he'd draw a face on a piece of paper, and that's how, you know, he saw things very visual. But there's definitely this connection there, this very sensual, it's not, like you said, taking sexuality and making it a thing that can sell a picture. You know, this a very intellectual concept of what you should and shouldn't see. It's something that's more instinctual, and it's something that is just part of life. And I think often when it comes to cinema, women aren't given the space to have that sexual life unless it's part of some other agenda. Whereas in Fellini and Borowczyk, and even Zhuławski as well, sex is just often part of everything else. It's just part of being a human.
Zhuławski's relationship with women is I think, much more complicated than Borowczyk's in a way that basically, I think it's very interesting that it would appear that these films appeal massively to a female audience, and that's great.
With Kowalski, the one thing that stands out to me, not going too much into a tangent, is with Kowalski, women are very emotional in his films, and they're often the most emotional. So the thing that I respond to in that is, in our society, at least, women can be a bit emotional, but it has to be this socially conventional type of emotional. You're not supposed to get hysterical or shout or get angry or be aggressively sexual. So I'm not saying he meant to put those things in his films. That is just the one thing that I respond to. It seems so anti-convention to have a woman like Romy Schneider, for example, this huge icon of French cinema, kind of dribbling and grizzling and, feels, I don't know, strangely powerful to me. It's like a big fuck you to the whole idea of how women should be presented in cinema, which is always very tempered. I find it cathartic to see someone like Isabelle Adjani just going off her fucking nut in the subway, because I think a lot of women feel like that. It's just not acceptable to express that, I guess. We might feel like that, but we can't do it. So, I'm not saying that's what he was. He obviously had a very complicated relationship with women as well, but as a byproduct of that, that's just something I personally respond to.
I agree exactly with what you're saying, and I think that what I get out of those films is something very similar to what you're describing. I'm just commenting on, in my limited dealings with certainly Borowczyk, and I've had a bit more with Kowalski, I think that I really did not in any way have any feeling, or of the people I've spoken to who work with Borowczyk, there was a misunderstanding, let's say, with the actress in Story of Sin, but I would say most of the crew Borowczyk worked with were women, and that wasn't out of any sort of political gesture. It was just that I think those were the people he worked most effectively with. Yeah. I mean, as editors and as producers and as co-scenarists and assistants and things like this. And I think this is very perplexing for male film critics when they see a film which they feel they should condemn it because there's lots of objectifying shots of female sexuality. But the paradox is that, the reality is that, I don't think he had a problem with women, anything but he saw things which Kat said.
There's a real warmth there for women, something I see with Fellini as well, and John Roland as well, and even someone like Jess Franco. And the last three of those are people that often get termed as misogynist just because they like to show women naked. Automatically that's misogynist, and there can't be any other reason for it. It's solely there for a male spectator's, his pleasure. And I know it's like this thing, they're trying to be kind of PC about it and support women, but actually what they're doing is saying, no women can be sexual because it's only for a man. Well, no, it can be for the woman herself. It can be for other women as well. It's not just this one thing. And I think Borowczyk understood that. And there's you can tell him and Kowalski are making those comparisons, but they're obviously, Kowalski was obviously a lot more cynical. Whereas with Borowczyk, I just see this very almost childish, gleeful joy in a lot of his work. The same with Fellini.
I think the problem comes from the fact that, that identity politics have pretty much, they've ruined film criticism, certainly for this generation. And what I mean by that is that you take an idea, like Laura Mulvey's idea of the female gaze, which, as an idea, it's fine. As an idea, it's fine, and as an idea,
it's been so abused.
Well, this is that we have to distinguish between the idea in itself and the applications of the idea. Now, the idea in itself, as it appeared, the journal and the context, you may not agree with that point, but the point is, you have to agree this is an interesting idea and it serves a function. The problem, I think, has happened when the idea has been badly applied. Yeah. And now the term has kind of gone mainstream, and you're having people using the term in a way which is what it sounds like, as opposed to actually going back to reading the paper. And you're ending up into this really reductive and quite brainless, I'm sorry to say, and that transcends gender.
It's like saying all audiences are completely passive and you're just sat there receiving messages from some male director. And it's like, no, you're not passive when you're a film watching and making a film. It's a collaboration. So the messages you're taking away might not even be the messages that the director intended to put there. It all depends. And so, like you said, it's become very reductive. And I think Borowczyk is one of those filmmakers. I've seen those people do the live tweet along things I don't go on Twitter very much for this exact reason, people sort of doing tweet-alongs to the Beast and that, especially when that box set and some strange uber-feminist anti-male gaze site doing some sort of tweet-alongs. They'd found some John Rollan on Netflix. They were doing Borowczyk. And the stuff they were reading from that, it was from this very kind of aggressive, annoyed tone of, look at the French man filming these naked women. And I just thought, no, I'm really sad that you didn't get the same thing that I did from it.
It gets ridiculous. I mean, there was the situation without getting further distracted into this, it was ridiculous. The César ceremony with Polanski, and then and there was something, I went onto Facebook for about, I don't know, a day, and then went back off again. But when I was on there, it was basically people attacking Claire Denis for not attacking Polanski. And then basically, so you think, hang on, so, when it comes to, I would say, I don't know, a role model of what a filmmaker should be, let alone a woman filmmaker, but a filmmaker, it's Claire Denis. And here you are attacking this person for not doing what you want them to do or expect them to do. And then it was followed by these two things. That's so fucking French. And then under that, it was like, well, this is an attitude adopted by women of a certain age. So you're thinking, hang on, so, right, we're trying to but racism is okay and ageism is fine. Don't you see the irony here? And then that's why I think it's just like, it's like the dying days of Al Qaeda. All these people will just end up in caves, just basically slaying each other for not being pure enough in their kind of handling of the term the female gaze.
Oh, well, it's like internalized misogyny, which is another fucking term I hate, because that's basically saying, unless you would agree with my stance on things, everything else that you think has been told to you, you've been brainwashed. No, actually, they're my fucking thoughts. It's just like...
The problem, I think, with this idea in approaching a film like, say, Borowczyk or Żuławski is that... say, for example, how does this way of looking at, the male gaze effectively objectifying this, that, and the other? Because Żuławski, he said it explicitly. The women become almost like, kind of avatars for his. And you look at a film like Possession, that he clearly, it's the Sam Neill character is definitely not if you're watching the film, it isn't like he's making the film saying, guys, look at the predicament this guy's in. No, the interest and focus, the Sam Neill character is a cipher that all the energy goes into the female characters.
Yeah, we talked about that on our episode, how a lot of men in Żuławski's films are very passive, and the women, by contrast, have all this rage. So it's interesting that he chooses women as his mouthpiece to express a lot of that. And I just find it fascinating.
The men in Borowczyk's films, and you take a film like Rosalie, which we've already talked about, the focus is on Rosalie. She's made pregnant by the master of the house, a guy abusing his position socially in the house. He gets her up the duff, gets her pregnant. She's got no economic or financial means, and so she buries them. And yet she is in court on charges of effectively child murder. So you're having a situation whereby a filmmaker, the way in which you present the story really dictates your particular political leanings and also your attitudes towards women. And it's the whole film is constructed around empathy and understanding of Rosalie. And it's in no way, the bastard in the story is the guy who we don't see on screen. He's the photo. And I think that, you can extend that to both, particularly Goto and Blanche in the way that, it's symbolism, but it's almost like a graphic shorthand, like the way he cuts in the opening titles between the castle and then Blanche's pet dove in a cage. I mean, we get it. She's trapped, but, it's a storytelling. It's a very visual way of saying her predicament. But you realize this is a story about a woman who just doesn't have any way out. And men are just going to fight around her, and the whole thing's just going to destroy. And then she commits suicide almost as almost as self-sacrifice. And you're having this Christian imagery all throughout the film. The idea that, in order to stop this violence, she does this, which is just a horrific, very pessimistic and depressing conclusion. And it's the similar thing. It's Glossia's sexuality. She doesn't initiate anything, but the very thing that she penetrates into the kind of the brain of Goto starts into motion this whole violent rise to power, which involves these elaborate schemes and murder. She's not responsible for that. The fact that basically the film climaxes with this moment of she gets chased to the top of this building and then basically looks at Goto, and you can see her imagining a life, as the kind of the governor's wife, another guy she doesn't have any feelings for and can't stand, or suicide. And then she just clearly chooses suicide. And you're thinking, well, is this a happy ending? She's escaped, but at what cost? And then is she dead because she opens her eyes at the end? That's another thing we haven't talked about. But yeah, it's a very bizarre, and you kind of think, well, no, the film is very much, although the narrative focus is on Goto. Does Borowczyk actually is he a hero? Is he an anti-hero? What is he? I mean, because I personally admire his cunning, his determination, but he's an absolute slimy bastard.
He is really horrible. I can't say I sympathise with him at all. He's a strange character because I don't even know if he is an anti-hero, because I don't know. Maybe it's just because of me. He's like a villain, and to me, it's Glossia's character that I respond to the most, even though she is almost on the peripheral, although she also becomes the catalyst. It's her character who seems to be the purest and the most heroic. Like when she jumps off and she makes that choice, I find that very powerful, that she makes this choice, even though it's also sad, ultimately sad as well, because she is literally the only character that you can actually sympathise with. Everyone else is just so horribly corrupt and jostling in this power struggle to get to the top of this chain where you get to own a pair of binoculars. It's like
I mean, it is almost approaching black humor, and the idea that she literally would rather be dead than sitting on a chair opposite. It's like the ultimate rebuff, isn't it? It's like, it's one like, it's the ultimate rebuff. I'm taking myself out. This thought in your head, even that's going to stop. And it's. But yeah, the focus. She is the focal point of the. She's the thing which initiates the story. She's the motor, and it's not necessarily, it's just the effect she has on these people. The fact that the emperor is not a bad guy. He's just, yes, he's a dictator, but he's kind of slightly sentimental and, a bit maudlin. And he's playing these children's games with her on the beach, and she mothers him, although she doesn't love him, and she loves Gono. And, I think it's very interesting, the characterization of the governor, because, he's not the monster. And I think the reason he tones down the governor is really, the real monster is Goto.
Well, it helps, too, that Pierre Brasseur is playing the governor, and even when he is monstrous, like he is in Eyes Without a Face, you still sympathize with him. So I think having a different person in that role, or if he had played it heavier, would have really turned us off from him. But he's there, and he doesn't come off, as completely evil. And, meanwhile, Goto is just always conniving, always looking for the angle. And when he actually sets up those dogs to take a fall and has them executed, it's just like, you can't get much worse in my book.
I know that he wanted Guy Tréjean, who plays, he cast in The Beast as the father. That's who he originally wanted for the role of the governor. And I know that there was a lot of fighting going on between Borowczyk and Pierre Brasseur. Brasseur was drinking quite a lot at this stage, and there were assistants whose job it was just to make sure he didn't drink too much.
Yeah, I think he died, 3 years later? I think it was 72.
Exactly. But I don't know about you, Kat, but I've always, because I encountered these films quite close together, I've always associated Eyes Without a Face with Goto. And in fact, I think you can look at a number of parallels between Franjou and Borowczyk, particularly the Le Tête contre l'amour, the film he made with Jean-Pierre Mocky, and you have all those little contraptions. You've got the scene at the end when she lets out all the dogs which are in those cages, and all the animals she lets out of the laboratory at the very end of the film and walks off, and you have the animals, the dogs in particular, running out across the beach. And
they're both sort of fairy tales as well, and Blanche as well. The doves in Eyes Without a Face, and then the doves, the symbolism of the doves in Blanche, and this idea of women being trapped, this sort of very fatalistic, doomed thing. These women being at the mercy. Well, in Eyes Without a Face, it's the father, but being trapped and being stuck in these horrible kind of nightmares where things are just happening to them. There is definitely a parallel.
And of course, Franjou, like Borowczyk, had this. I mean, of course, he's one of the co-founders of the French Cinematheque, and along with Henri Langlois, he's kind of responsible for saving a lot of this kind of very early silent cinema. And of course, he remakes one of the serials as Judex. So you're actually having a filmmaker who's having this dialogue with this very kind of early cinema, but finding a new way to make films in the mode of like a serial or like the Vampire or Judex in a modern way. And I think there is a parallel there. And of course, there are Lotte Eisner, who was working at the German Jewish cinema critic who was working in Paris. She was the critic who was fighting that Goto got the Prix Georges Sadoul, and there's a letter she wrote personally to Borowczyk commenting on the banning of the film in Poland and comparing the situation in Poland and the world that Goto depicts as to what she experienced in Nazi Germany and Kristallnacht and things like this. So it is fascinating how you're having people, it's like a Rorschach inkprint in the way that you're having half the audience perceiving the film as a political allegory, sort of a parable. And then you have this fairy tale aspect. And I think that's really what gives the film its longevity, because you have a film, it's like, I don't know, a Vaida film about politics. It's obviously politics as its subject, and it is about politics. That's the thing. Whereas what I think Borowczyk was doing, and in some ways Żuławski was doing as well, is turning, coming up with a fairy tale which may have resonance with contemporary Polish politics or whatever is happening. And The Devil is a good example in that respect. And I think it's true in Goto. It could be a fairy tale, exciting Angela Carter, Terry Gilliam, or Jean-Pierre Jeunet and Marc Caro were huge fans of Goto, and they programmed it at L'Étrange Festival as part of their carte blanche. You had Patrice Leconte. I mean, he was the biggest fan of Borowczyk, writing in Cahiers du Cinéma articles on Cabal and Goto, which are fantastic and very, very insightful and interesting and important articles about the significance of those films. So he was having this influence, but the film meant different things to different people.
I think that's a wonderful thing about it, though. I think it is that you can read so many different things into it, and people take away, the things that resonate with them. I think that goes back to what we were saying about this idea with the physical. Removing language, it gives you that space to explore and to take different things away from it, because you haven't got this very kind of strict spoken narrative that tells you exactly how you're supposed to think and feel about something. He allows the audience to have that freedom, which is something you don't find in Hollywood film, to make their own minds up and take what they want from it. And I think, in that respect, he was a very generous filmmaker, because he offered the audiences so much. He wasn't dictating to them and saying, this is how you should feel about this film, or I made this film as, I love Vincente Aranda, but he made The Blood-Spattered Bride, which is an allegory of Francoist Spain, and he would talk about it and say, well, this means this, and this was, and what I'm doing is, this is a very political film, and it's fascinating, but it doesn't then give you the space to perhaps appreciate it as a fairy tale based on Le Fanu, because the emphasis is, on Spanish politics, and it is on fascism. So it doesn't give you that room. And when Sam and me did the commentary for that one for Mondo Macabre, this guy wrote a review saying, "Well, I didn't expect a Spanish history and political lesson, listening to this. Why can't we just appreciate the boobs?" And it's like, well, you can.
That's another difference between Żuławski and Borowczyk, and the way that Żuławski would very happily give you a history lesson in an interview is a key for unlocking the devil, for example. But on the other hand, Borowczyk not only went out of his way to say what the films were not, he was amused that they were both banned in Spain, in Franco's Spain, and in communist Poland. It's presented as a joke by him, but he doesn't actually he doesn't talk about politics explicitly in interviews. It's not immediately clear where his politics lie, and it's kind of interesting to think where the strength of the work is the fact that it doesn't have that interview in which the filmmaker says what it's about.
Love that. I love evasive filmmakers and ones who are clearly just taking the piss. Herzog does it. These people come in with this very pretentious kind of, wow, is it that you're saying this? And they just kind of laugh and go, wow.
Well, it's also about extending the shelf life of your film, because if you have like Goto and you think, okay, if you have a fairy tale about a tenacious criminal that through persistence rises to be the ruler of his particular world, well, that certainly has a bearing on, I don't know, contemporary American politics or Russian politics. And you could say that you could look at Goto, and of course it's a fantastic film, but at the end of the day, it's a film about a rigged election.
Yeah.
And Borowczyk himself described the film as a realist film. He didn't call it a surrealist film, just as it wasn't a case of just being perverse and saying, I don't make erotic films, and you think, oh yeah, right. Or this is it's not being ironic. This is a realistic film. It's just that it's like a dream. All the bits are in slightly off-kilter arrangements and things like this. The themes it addresses are very realistic themes. Unrequited love, the stasis of experiencing or in a social, hermetic, closed environment where there's no real feeling of change. It's not a dystopia, it's not a utopia, it's just stasis. This is very much connected with the drama at the time. A lot of critics drew parallels with Borowczyk's animations, with the playwright Ionesco and certainly Beckett. And I think that the look of something like Goto, it's interesting to look at how people were staging Waiting for Godot, and they were kind of giving people Charlie Chaplin-esque bowler hats and costumes. I mean, as far as I remember, that's not actually in the text. It was an interpretation. It's not a million miles away from that kind of a visual approach, which Borowczyk is this sort of sad, melancholic echo of silent film comedies, but drowned out in this kind of desolate, timeless, endless landscape. Recently, I was watching Being There, the Hal Ashby film.
Oh, I saw that recently as well.
And I think there is an interesting parallel you could draw between Goto and Being There in the way that they are both about people who, the film is about the ascendance, is social mobility. So in the case of Being There, you've got a gardener basically becoming the kingmaker for the White House, and you've got a binoculars thief becoming the ruler of a totalitarian state in the case of Goto. Now, Being There is based on the novel by Jerzy Kosinski, who was always getting into trouble because of plagiarism, and that became, the narrative and everything else, and how he dealt with those accusations. And there was a lot of Polish commentary when Being There came out about how it was very similar to a book which was very popular in Poland in the 1930s, The Career of Nicodemus Zima. And there's been a couple of films and a TV series of it, but it is about an opportunist, a social climber who kind of makes this ascent. And I don't know for certain, but I do wonder if that book and that story, which was very popular, and it sort of entered Polish consciousness to describe a particular person. This person's a Nicodemus Zima, a greasy opportunist, basically. And maybe the concept of that was, how could he translate this into his world? How could he make it applicable to the world of which he'd experienced? Because, of course, he went through the war in forced labor and then went into art college, which was then mid through his studies taken over effectively by socialist realism, the kind of visual imposition of Stalinism. Could you translate a story about an opportunist into this kind of strange world, which may or may not draw heavily on the kind of the Nowohuta building sites and maybe these experiences in the war, or maybe something completely fantastic? So I've often wondered that could be a possible inspiration.
That's interesting. That is really interesting. Although Peter Sellers is in Being There, isn't manipulative, is he? He's more like the idiot.
He's nice. I mean, he's much nicer than in the original, the story I'm talking, the Nicodemus, who's much more. But in Being There, as you say, he's more of this kind of like a Eurodivi, like a holy fool, isn't he?
Yeah. Interesting.
But it's interesting. I think these kind of like it's how do you, maybe what's interesting is how you draw on your roots and express them in your form. I mean, it was the case with Joseph Conrad in the way that a lot of Polish commentators on Victory noticed that the plot is very influenced by the Stefan Żeromski novel, which Borowczyk made Story of Sin on. And what Conrad brought to the English literature was this kind of vast knowledge of Polish literature, which was inflected through the French language. And so you end up with filmmakers like Borowczyk, who is working and flourishing in France, but they're bringing with them an approach to graphics, which was kind of fostered in Poland, an approach to music, which was fostered in Poland, and they sort of blossom with artists like Parmigiani, finding a producer like Anatol Domon who says, well, maybe you should work with Mondiak, maybe you should work with this person, that person. Maybe, what about Alan Rene, And we need to find a way of addressing cultural heritage, but not being limited by it. Borowczyk himself got quite annoyed when people would say, oh, well, you're coming from the tradition of Bruno Schulz or Witkacy and Gombrowicz. And he would go, well, yeah, just because I'm Polish and weird doesn't mean we all go to the same school.
Brilliant.
So the idea that, well, we have to look at these things more generally, and the fact that the films which were exciting him and her interest were often German films which he was seeing in Poland, because of course this is before communist takeover, and he grew up in in Poland, and you had German films and French films and Italian films and King Kong. So the idea that we make films and our field of vision is limited to the country in which we live in is really naive, because that's not how cinema worked. It was international, the way that art is international. You can see an exhibition of a French painter in Germany. It's important to be, on the one hand, sensitive to cultural specific possible influences like that particular novel, at the same time not be limited by them, because I think the echoes and parallels between the magic realist novels or Franju cinema or Angela Carter's books, that's what's interesting, the way these things kind of rather than doing like a dot-to-dot approach to who influenced who, more like kind of parallels, contrasts, differences, similarities, and I think that the constellation around Borowczyk, writers like Angela Carter, graphic artists like Klimovsky, animators like the Quay brothers, and filmmakers, even Peter Greenaway, it's a really interesting constellation.
All right, guys, let's go ahead and take a break, play some messages from our sponsors, and then a preview for next week's show.
This is an American Red Cross blood donation alert. We are currently facing a severe blood shortage during this coronavirus outbreak. Healthy blood and platelet donors are asked to make an appointment to give now. Donating blood is safe and can help save lives. Cancer patients, accident victims, and so many others continue to need life-saving transfusions. So please schedule your appointment now by visiting redcrossblood.org or calling 1-800-RED-CROSS. You can make a difference.
We asked the man on the street what he thought about the After Movie Diner website and podcast, but sadly he had never heard of either and was on his way to the doctors to have a mole removed. Or it could have been a badger. He wasn't sure. It felt bigger than a mole. Also, he wasn't sure how it got up there in the first place. Anyway, we asked all the famous people, like Michael Ironside, Fred the Hammer Williamson, Ted Raimi, Barbara Crampton, Cynthia Rothrock, and so on, that they've interviewed over there on the After Movie Diner website and podcast, what they thought about the After Movie Diner website and podcast. But most of them said that if we quoted them, we would be hearing from their comical southern lawyers, complete with bow tie, meat gut, and brow mopping handkerchief. So instead, we say who cares what anyone thinks of you After Movie Diner website and podcast. You are awesome just the way you are, so don't you go changing. If you want to see for yourself, go to aftermoviediner.com or find the After Movie Diner podcast on Blog Talk Radio, iTunes, Stitcher, and wherever podcasts are found. The After Movie Diner, doing it their own way since 2011.
It's not easy having a good time, and it's not cheap either. Every week, the Projection Booth brings you a new show, possibly even two, focusing on all genres of cinema. If you've sat through the 7-hour Conan episode, the 6-hour Star Wars episode, or even the hour-long Superman episode, you know that Mike and his co-host put forth a lot of work into researching the movies, tracking down the interview subjects, and putting together one of the best podcasts on the internet. Now I'm asking you if you can repay all that hard work by giving back to the Projection Booth. The show has a Patreon fundraiser at Patreon. That's patreon.com/projection booth. You can donate as little as $1 a month. That's $12 a year. At least 50 great shows and 2 terrible ones. That's the price of 2 matinee tickets. Now isn't the Projection Booth worth it? Once again, that's patreon.com/projection booth. Donate today. It's the right thing to do.
Między wszystkimi historiami jest jedna, której nie słyszałeś. Pełno w niej widm i fantomów.
Dlaczego mam uczucie, jak gdybym już tam kiedyś był?
Chcę wiedzieć, czy to wszystko mogło się zdarzyć.
I tak, i nie. Bo są rzeczy, które są za wielkie, za wspaniałe.
Porwania, gonitwy, zdrady. Ja sam nie mogę wyjść ze snu.
One tylko próbują. Próbują się zdarzyć.
Czy znasz historię, której czas już nie zmieni? Czy starczy ci cierpliwości, aby jej wysłuchać? Nie bój się.
That's right, we'll be back next week to wrap up Polish Month with a look at Wojciech Haas's Hourglass Sanatorium. Until then, I want to thank this week's co-hosts, Kat and Daniel. So, Daniel, what has been keeping you busy, sir?
I've had the pleasure of working with Criterion on 2 releases. The Cremator. We re-edited a documentary where Bildstörung, the German distributor, and we went with Uri Hertz to the locations of the Cremator. So it's been nice to revisit that. And also working a little bit on their forthcoming release of Come and See. And besides that, a project of restoring films from the Caucasus and Central Asia. We did the Fixer Film, the restoration company with which I've worked on many films, including Żuławski and Borowczyk. We've been restoring the outtakes from The Colour of Pomegranates and presenting them. Just to contradict everything we said in the podcast, now I can be a pretentious wanker. Yeah, we made an art installation. We made an art installation out of outtakes. So that was presented in Rotterdam Film Festival and in Yerevan last year, and now we're making a version which can travel. And yeah, that's what's been keeping me busy. And it's very difficult to talk about travel in this particular moment, isn't it?
And Kat, when you're not out there winning Rondo Awards, what are you up to?
Oh, Joe. I'm too important for this show now.
Yeah, this is the last appearance of Kat Ellinger on the projection booth. She's going to get a new chair, get some beige paint for her room.
Well, actually announced this week. So I did a commentary for Shameless, restoring Flavia the Heretic, which is one of my favourite nunsploitation films. It's just really gritty, angry, feminist thesis on war and religion, and it's got Florinda Balkan in it. So I did that commentary last year, but they've only just finished the restoration. So that's just been announced because I've been dying to talk about that. And I've also done a couple of things for Eureka, for their Masters of Cinema series. For Crisscross, I did a written essay on Siod Mac and the Noir, and then a video essay for The Foreign Affair, Billy Wilder's Foreign Affair, talking about Marlene Dietrich, Billy Wilder, and Berlin, their time in Berlin, obviously before they both went to Hollywood, and all the decadent elements in that. So that was kind of fun as well. But now I have to give all that up. Now I'm like a kind of queen, monster kid queen.
We are among royalty.
And obviously my 11,000 book projects that I've got on the go. Determined to finish at least one in lockdown, because I just don't get all these people are suddenly like, oh, I'm so creative, I'm writing all these novels. And all I've been able to do is sit there staring at the wall or watching 70s romantic comedies. Like, that's it. And eating a lot of cheesecake when I can get shopping deliveries.
That was one of the nice things about, well, maybe not nice is the right word, but it was a relief because there was this literally hundreds of films which Borowczyk talked about making, and when he deposited a big part of his archive in the Cinematheque before he died, but when he did die, I mean, we kind of organised Dominique Duverger, who was the secrétaire who worked on the script of adapting it into French of Goto. We both put these papers into order before putting them into the Cinematheque, and it turned out that most of these projects were just basically like a post-it note with a title, like Madame Bovary. and there was like maybe like one page. I thought, that makes me feel, maybe not more productive, but not as underproductive compared to Borowczyk, because basically it just seemed, how did he find the time to do all of this? And there was a lot of material. It was a crazy amount of stuff for films which were not made. But at the same time, a lot of those were just titles.
Well, the whole idea of Borowczyk doing Bovary, he would have just been the perfect person. I read about that, or I don't know if you mentioned it, but I don't know what happened with the project, but Neil Snowden from PS Publishing at one point was floating a book project, but where writers would write about a fictional film. So something that was conceived but never got into script development. And I think the project's still going on down the line, but that was what I picked because I just thought that would be the one film that I'd like. And the idea was you'd write about it, you know, imagining what the film could have been like. A bit like Fellini's Flash Gordon as well.
Well, thank you so much, guys, for being on the show. Thanks to everybody for listening. Please head on over to the website, projectionboothpodcast.com, where you can find out more about today's episode. You'll also find a link over to Patreon, where you can make a donation to the show. Every donation we get helps the Projection Booth take over the world.
If you enjoy this show and want more people to know about it, head on over to iTunes, leave a comment, and rate it 5 stars. Make sure you like and share us on Facebook, and don't forget to follow us on Twitter. Just search for Christopher Media. Thank you in advance for supporting Christopher Media by clicking on the PayPal button and by clicking through to all the sponsors who support ChristopherMedia.net. Most importantly, we would like to take the time to extend an extra special thanks to you. Christopher Media could not exist without your support. Thank you for visiting ChristopherMedia.net, and thank you for listening. Christopher Media. Let's make some noise.